Hello and welcome, everyone, both here in person in the audience and online through Zoom. I'm Ghassan Moazin. I'm an assistant professor here at the Hong Kong Institute for the Humanities and Social Sciences. And today we have another installment of our Delta on the Move lecture series. That's a new project that we are running here at the Institute on the historical development of the Greater Bay Area. I'm today also joined by my colleague, Dr. John Wong, here, who is the lead researcher on that project. So today we are very happy to welcome to the lecture series Dr. Gina Ann Tam from Trinity University. She, I think, will be known to many of you already, but just to briefly introduce her, she received her PhD from Stanford and is now an associate professor of modern Chinese history at Trinity University. And also the co-director of Women and Gender Studies there. Her first book was published to much acclaim with Cambridge University Press. It was called Dialects and Nationalism in China, 1860 to 1960, and it was the winner of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians. And today we are very happy that she presents some of her research here at the lecture series. Her talk is titled How Fangyan Became Dialects, Language, Politics, Identity, and Power in China, 1900 to today. Now, before I hand things over to Gina, just briefly something about the format. So, Professor Tam is going to talk. Tam is going to talk for around 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. We'll be running this hybrid. So, for those in the audience, when we get to the Q&A, you can just ask questions as usual. For those joining us online, please submit any questions you have through the Q&A button in Zoom, and I'll then read them out during the Q&A period, and Professor Tam can then get back to you. But I don't want to take up any more time. So Gina, if you're ready, please feel free to start.
Yes. Okay. I'm gonna take this off just to talk a little bit. Thank you so much, Ghassan, for having me. And thank you to HKIHSS, yes, for arranging this. Just sort of personally, Hong Kong was the first place I ever came to in Asia, which was many, many years ago. It has always held an incredibly special place in my heart, has taught me an enormous amount about identity and history that sort of is seeped throughout this book. So it is genuinely an honor to be able to talk about it here at Hong Kong University. Although I will say the first time I came here, I was at CUHK, but we don't have so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. And I actually want to start with a story from this city, from Hong Kong. It was, gosh, when I first wrote this book, it wasn't that long ago. Now it's been like 7 years since this happened, but that's okay. So in 2016, the Hong Kong Department of Education sent out a packet of materials to instructors around the city about how to teach the Chinese national language, Putonghua or Mandarin, to school children. Unexpectedly, this packet of short articles about language pedagogy, which is not usually newsworthy, made headlines across the city. And the reason was that one of the articles in this packet made the argument, or said very explicitly, that Cantonese, the Chinese language most frequently spoken in the city of Hong Kong, was not a mother tongue, right? His argument, which really wasn't the focal point of his article, but it was right front and center at the beginning of the article, centered on the linguistic categorization of Cantonese. So he argued that it was simply objectively true. It's not an issue of opinion or anything like that, but it's objectively true that mother tongues are languages whose speakers belong to one ethnic group or nationality. Cantonese speakers are not a separate ethnic group. They are part of the Han Chinese ethnic group, reasoned, and there is only one language that can represent the Han ethnicity and the Chinese nation, and that is Mandarin or Putonghua. Cantonese, on the other hand, he called a Fangyan term. A term that we could render, if we sort of broke it down into its like components here, right? Like language of a place. It is one of dozens, if not hundreds, depending on how we sort of break it up, spoken throughout the Sinophone world, the Chinese-speaking world. As we can see from this map here, although this doesn't even capture it, right? Because we would also want to probably include Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Southeast Asia, as well as places like the United States and Europe, right? So, but nonetheless, I think this map does capture some pretty impressive linguistic diversity here. Now, in English, we usually almost always translate the term Fangyan as dialect. And if we're going to go back to this consultant from 2016, he thought this was a very good translation. He clearly believed that Cantonese, like most of the world's dialects, are nothing more than linguistic variants, right? They are a variant of a language, which is very different from something like Putonghua. It is the one language worthy of, in his estimation, being called a language and therefore a mother tongue of the Chinese people. Now, the claim that Putonghua could alone be considered a mother tongue for all Chinese people obviously did not sit well in the city of Hong Kong. Right? As many Hong Kong journalists, everyday citizens, even the chief executive of Hong Kong, at this point it was Carrie Lam, declared, no, Cantonese is a mother tongue, right? And their pushbacks, there were lots of different ways to push back on this, but one of the ways was that they tried to argue that calling a Fangyan a dialect, right? Like calling Cantonese a Fangyan, if we think of them as dialects, doesn't actually make sense, right? So we have YouTube videos, news articles, even graphic comics that make the case that dialects are not mutually intelligible with one another, right? If I speak a dialect of something, then somebody who speaks another dialect of that language or the language itself would be able to understand me, right? There are plenty of Mandarin speakers who have trouble understanding Cantonese. Myself among one of them. My Cantonese is not great, and I had to learn it separately because it's not mutually intelligible for me, right? Also, dialects lack distinctive vocabulary and grammar. Again, if we have Cantonese speakers in the room, we know that there's a lot of very unique Cantonese vocabulary and Cantonese grammatical patterns, right? And so I would argue that most linguists would agree. I'm trying to make sure that I'm here, so I'm not quite, all right. I'm making sure I'm keeping up with my slides here. Now, certainly a lot of linguists would agree with the people who would argue that Cantonese can be a mother tongue in the general sense, because when we think about dialects, we often think of them being subordinate. Calling something a dialect only makes sense if it is a dialect of something, right? Moreover, many linguists will stress, again, that dialects are mutually intelligible with one another, and this doesn't apply not only just to Cantonese, but to most Chinese Fangyan, right? Also, if I went to Xiamen, that language would also be not mutually intelligible with Mandarin or really with Cantonese, right? It's thus really interesting that the presumption that Fangyan are dialects is so prevalent, right? We see this all over the place. We see this from the governments of the PRC. We see this from the governments of Singapore. We see this from educational institutions, right? My own educational institution, right, where I work, we have a Chinese major. We only teach Putonghua, right? We don't sit here and say that there are lots of Chinese languages. We only really talk about one. An international organization. So I'm not going to call out this website, it's an interpreter's website, but right, you can see the Cantonese dialect is a variety of the Chinese language, right? So again, I don't want to sort of name shame here because this is a very, very common thing to say, okay? And I find that really interesting, given how very distinct languages like Cantonese and other Fangyan are, right? Yet beyond this disagreement about terminology, I find it even more interesting that the debate over like what Cantonese is would have resulted in such fierce outrage at all, right? Hong Kongers get pretty upset when you call Cantonese, at least some do anyway, right? It's something that's really emotional for people. And the reason I think is because the stakes of this debate extend far beyond what we call Cantonese. By calling something a language or a dialect, we bestow upon it significances and limitations that extend beyond just the word, right? So if we call Putonghua a national standard and Fangyan variants, we imply that Putonghua can represent China or Chinese in a way that Cantonese or any other Fangyan could. And this isn't just sort of navel-gazing interpretations here. These are very commonly stated by the government of the People's Republic of China, right? For instance, a frequently used textbook on the history of the Chinese language, the author writes that Mandarin is the only language that allows the Chinese nation to be preserved, develop, and progress. News articles frequently feature quotes of school children saying, "We are Chinese, therefore we speak Putonghua." This is from a like school child activity or a school activity to school. I think this was a few years ago. But here she has a little sign. This young girl has a sign that says "Promulgate Mandarin" or Putonghua, and together build the China dream. So where does this come from, right? This widespread insistence, both within the PRC, but also in places outside of it, right? That Chinese Fangyan ought to not only be thought of as dialects, but also be imagined as subsidiary, less important, or even conflatable with Mandarin, right? So sometimes you'll get this, we don't have to teach Cantonese, we already teach Mandarin, right? That's something that's quite common in educational institutes in the States, right? And so the purpose of this talk is to talk a little bit about this from a historical perspective and talk about how this happened, why this happened, and why it matters, right? More specifically, this talk will show how the presumption that Fangyan are nothing more than dialects, a presumption that very much affects the relationship between language and identity today, resulted in battles over competing understandings of what it means to be Chinese and what the Chinese nation is, that began in the late 19th century and were solidified in the early years of the PRC. So first, I'm going to talk just very briefly about these ideas of language and Fangyan before the 20th century. After that, I'll talk a little bit about the construction of the Chinese national language in the early years of the Chinese Republic, focusing on how battles over what the national language should be sparked a major shift in how Fangyan were imagined. Sorry. Then I will talk a little bit about how this hierarchy between national language and everything else became normalized and baked into sort of the educational and academic bureaucratic structures from the later years of the Republican period to the early years of the PRC. And then I'll talk just very briefly about the historical legacies of that today. I won't talk much about Hong Kong, but I would be more than happy to talk about the case of Hong Kong in Q&A. So I hope we do, given where we are. Now, as you can see from this outline and also like the title of my book, most of the story I will tell today takes place in the 20th century. But the word Fangyan has actually existed for a very, very long time. Most historians will pinpoint early research on local Chinese languages to this book called the Fangyan, or Local Speech, from the 1st century AD. It's a big compilation of words recorded in different regions throughout the territory of the Han Dynasty, right, which is when this book was written. Now, importantly, while the word Fangyan here denoted local language, I don't think there's good evidence to suggest that there was a hierarchical implication here, right? That there was a language and that everything else was sort of subsidiary. And perhaps because of this, when early European sojourners began to come to China in the late 16th century, they didn't really know what to call Chinese languages, right? They understood pretty quickly that people spoke a lot of different things, right? But they didn't necessarily know what to call everything. So the first European Jesuit to live in China, he used the Latin word vernacular to describe all of the different local languages shown around, which we would not necessarily translate as vernacular. We would probably translate that closer to colloquial languages. Right? Later missionaries would use the word vernacular, however, and dialect to a growing list of terms and their corollaries in French and German and Spanish and Portuguese and these other European languages. By the mid-19th century, we have a rapid expanding population of Protestant missionaries, who were given imperialistic license to settle throughout the Qing Empire, and they tended to use these terms interchangeably, right, in English or French or these other sort of European languages. To the best of my knowledge, and I always say to the best of my knowledge because sometimes you don't know what you don't know, but to the best of my knowledge, and I really did try to find it, the first person to actually sort of put the word Fangyan and the word dialect side by side was Herbert Giles in his Chinese English dictionary. There are, in fact, Chinese English dictionaries well before Herbert Giles's, but they either don't include either the English word dialect or the Chinese word Fangyan, or they translate it differently, right? So there's some that have the word like Tuyu, and they'll translate that as dialect, or they'll have this sort of different terms for these things. This is the first time I could actually find those terms side by side. This is 1892. But just because he published this didn't lead right away to a consistent translation. And we can attribute a lot of this inconsistency to the fact that translation is only as good as a translator's knowledge. And before the 19th century, Europeans just didn't know that much about China. Faced with the unknown, they drew parallels between their scattered observations and known phenomena at home. And when things didn't really fit, they approximated, right? Like we all do this, right? When we go somewhere like, oh, this is kind of like, right? So like, if I see a bolo bao, right, in Hong Kong, I mean, this is kind of like a concha back in San Antonio. There's similarities, right? And so this was often done in the 19th century without giving it a lot of thought. Occasionally, missionaries noted the limitations of their menu of terms. The person I found who really thought about this a lot was this man, Carstairs Douglas. He was stationed in Xiamen, and he looked at the languages around him and noted that they were mutually unintelligible with the language spoken in the imperial capital. He also observed that the local Xiamen language was spoken by members of all classes. It was not simply a lower class language. So because of that, he just didn't think a lot of these English terms fit very well, right? Because colloquial or vernacular presumed a class differential. It was just spoken by lower classes, but the Xiamen Fangyan or Xiamen language, or whatever you want to call it, was spoken by everybody, right? And dialect implied they were branches or auxiliaries. He's like, that doesn't fit either. So he ultimately settles on vernacular of and spoken language of to describe what so he's here using Amoy vernacular. He decided that was better than colloquial. But even then, he has like a 25-page introduction with the tiniest font I've ever seen, where he talks about how there's not a really good translation for this, right? Our English terms just don't fit. Okay, so he does this with a lot of reservations or qualifications, but again, not everybody put this much thought into it, right? If they put much thought into it at all, okay? So to me though, there's another reason for why there's no consensus on what to call the languages or what is spoken throughout Chinese territory, right? And that reason was much more fundamental. For European and American observers, a necessary component of a cohesive nation was one language. But when they looked at Qing China, they couldn't agree on what was Chinese, right? Was it the formal written language that appeared in elite texts, what we might call today classical Chinese? They called it, there's lots of different terms for it, but Europeans thought that was a lot like Latin. They made that comparison a lot. So some of them were like, this is the only thing we can call Chinese because it's used throughout the entire territory. Right. Others said the oral language spoken at the imperial capital, right? This is spoken by the government, therefore that is what we call Chinese. There are big, huge debates about this. But ultimately, because they couldn't agree on what constituted the Chinese language, or even if there was one, so there were a lot of people who were saying there isn't a Chinese language, it doesn't exist. So there was no real consensus on what to call everything else, right? Because of this, by the end of the 19th century, their debates about vocabulary and definitions converged on one agreed upon point. The fact that China's linguistic landscape didn't fit their vocabulary and the fact that there wasn't a clear Chinese language was a sign that the Chinese nation itself was not modern. And again, European observers are very blunt about this. They're like, clearly China's very backwards. Okay? I'm not saying that, just want to be clear, right? This was their conclusion. By the end of the 19th century, however, Chinese elites there we go. I missed the Opium War happened, and that's when Protestants came, so that was that slide. Okay. The making of the Chinese national language. So by the end of the 19th century, Chinese elites began to voice similar concerns. A half a century of war and imperialism have left Chinese elites anxious about their country's waning power and their government's unwillingness to meet the challenges before them. Many of them had traveled to Japan and to Europe, and then by the time we get to the early 20th century, the United States, where they faced head-on the very nature of a newly globalized world shaped by Western imperialism. There, many came to the conclusion that new technology and warships or even government structures, while important, were insufficient to make China modern enough to be recognized and be powerful and be sovereign in this new world order. And one of the things that would sort of guarantee and shore up China's sovereignty was a national language that would unify the citizenry and prove that they were in fact a cohesive modern nation. Okay, so now the story of how China determined its national language is a well-worn one. People, I know for some of those of you who have done research before, my guess is this is something that's common to all of us. There are things people like to tell you about your research when you tell them what they're researching. And the story of how the Chinese national language was formed, in particular in Hong Kong and Guangzhou, is a story people like to tell me. And it usually goes something like this. So there's a conference at the beginning of the Chinese Republic to choose the national language. Representatives came from all over China and they voted. And those from Beijing won the battle to serve as the nation's linguistic representative. I would not be the least bit surprised if people in this room or on Zoom have heard that Cantonese lost that status of national language by 2 votes or 3 votes or 5 votes. The number of votes changes every time I get told the story, but just squeaked by, right? Now, with a story like this, it might be easy to presume that this was the moment, this conference, that we see a fundamental shift in what a Fangyan is, from just something that people speak to a hierarchically subordinate thing to an overarching national tongue. But like any good historical story, this one is a mix of historical events laced with strategic myth-making. So, as we all know, Beijing's language would eventually be chosen to serve as the basis of China's national language, right? That's what it is today. And there was a conference. There were lots of them, right? And in one of them, there was something where they really did try to nail down how we would pronounce like 6,000 something characters in a Chinese national language. What is a unified pronunciation, right? I have a picture later on. Okay. But this retelling, I think, also misses some stuff. First, it misses the fact that as a result of that conference that everyone likes to focus on, they did determine a national language, but it was not the first national language, right? It was not what today we call Putonghua, it was something else. So there was another national language that was slightly different. And while linguistically, again, there's some real differences, but there's a lot of similarities. I think the way it was imagined is really interesting. And so I'm going to talk about that briefly. But what I find most misleading about this particular story is the idea that this was a contentious process because everyone was just clamoring for their own Fangyan to be the national representative, right? So it's like Guangzhou just didn't have enough people at the conference, right? Because what that implies is that the operative question for everybody at the beginning of the 20th century was, which Fangyan do we choose? Meaning that we were simply plucking one language out of many to serve as the national language, and therefore this process creates a hierarchy alone, right? But if we look at how these debates unfolded, and in particular how we choose China's first national language, we find that this wasn't really the question being asked. It was much less the sort of operative question wasn't really which one do we choose, but rather what does it mean for a language to represent a nation? And that is a very different kind of question because it opens up possibilities beyond just simply saying we're going to pick something that already exists. Now, few men in the late Qing articulated this thinking more than this man, Zhang Taiyan or Zhang Bingling. Right? He's something of an enigma to contemporary scholars because he doesn't fit into our neat little boxes, right? He's not really conservative, he's not really a reformer, he's not really a radical, but he's kind of all three at the same time. And among the reasons he was so famous was because he popularized the idea that China's new nation had to be of and for the ethnic Han Chinese people, in particular leaning quite heavily into sort of being against the Manchurian ruling class of China's Qing dynasty. And he doesn't, and sort of in this vein, right, he writes a series of articles that then become a book that end up implicating this political position. He doesn't actually argue in this book about what the Chinese nation should be, but it implicates it, right? And because he talks a lot about language, and it is this book, it's called New Fangyan, right? Or New Dialect, however you would like to translate this, right? Very clearly a nod to the Han Dynasty work Fangyan. Right? So this was published throughout the year, like 1907, 1908, 1909, around there, as a series of articles. What it does is it traces the etymology of several hundred regional phrases back to the Han Dynasty, and in so doing, sort of makes the argument that there was an original historical Han language, not Han Dynasty, but like Han people, right? Language at the dawn of civilization, and today's Fangyan sort of are like all have traces of that original language. Okay, so therefore, sort of the goal here is to show, or what he ends up doing, right, and what he ends up making the argument for is that all Fangyan have this shared core, that they were time capsules within which lay a unified Han Chinese past. He also argued in other articles, not necessarily in this book, but in other articles, that while all Fangyan had a connection to this shared core, some preserved it better than others. Right. And this work directly informed Zhang's prescriptions for a new Chinese national language, which he made in other articles, right? He believed it should be a constructed language that ultimately sort of recreated the historical pith of the country's diverse Fangyan. It would need a base language upon which it would be built. Guided by his anti-Manchu politics, he was very against using Beijing's Fangyan as the standard, right? That was, if he had a political position that was very clear, that was it, right? Is that he was very anti-Beijing Fangyan. He had various other political positions on language, but in terms of this story, that was a big one. He argued that Northern Fangyan were no longer purely Chinese because they had been contaminated by centers of contact with Northern non-Han groups, including the Manchus, who he pretty vociferously opposed. Right? Instead, he suggested that the Chinese national language be loosely based off of the language spoken in the center of China, which he called, I don't have this slide here, but I'm presuming we sort of know where this is. He called it the language of the states of Chu and Han. It's around where today's Hubei is. So after 1911, proposals like Zhang's seemed quite attuned to the needs of the new nation, as many people agreed with his sort of anti-Beijing politics and anti-Manchu politics. Right? The 1911 revolution had a pretty strong anti-Manchu sort of tint to it. Right? And a lot of people opposed making Beijing's language the national language for that reason. And his ideas attracted prominent supporters, including people who were at that conference, right? The one that everybody likes to talk about. This is actually not the conference. This is a later conference. I couldn't find a picture of the actual conference, sorry. But it captures the idea here. And so they have this contentious meeting. This is in 1913, 2 years after the 1911 revolution. And they came up with a language that in some ways was inspired by Zhang's ideas. Zhang was not there. Many of his students were, though. And they essentially create a language that is about 80 to 90% similar to the phonology of Beijing, depending on how you calculate it, but was still a constructed language with the remaining 10 to 20% of its phonology, comprised of characteristics taken from other Fangyan. In particular, a big thing that they pushed for was in a lot of Southern Fangyan, there's a distinction made with the rusheng, which is sort of it's the stop ending. So for Cantonese speakers in the room, right? So, like a character that in Mandarin, or a series of characters that might be pronounced shi in Mandarin, some might be pronounced shi and some might be pronounced si. So that stop ending is the rusheng. It is something that is more common in Southern Fangyan than Northern Fangyan. Northern Fangyan do not have that, right? Okay, so that was a big thing. Southerners at this conference were like, if we lose our rusheng, we will die. They were really dramatic about it. Okay, so that's one of the things that gets included in this unit. I want to draw attention to this episode because it shows that many of the first constructors of the Chinese national language really strongly believed that we could not just pick a Fangyan to represent the national body, because no Fangyan could actually represent the nation in its entirety. It was a recognition that China was a multilingual country and therefore it needed to represent, like you couldn't leave out an entire country of people who speak other languages, right? Or other Fangyan, other Chinese Fangyan. So rather, a language that at once represented the nation's present while also embodying its shared ethnic past needed to be something that they themselves built. And they're very clear about this. They're like, constructing languages is okay because this is the we want to create something that really represents us. So there was not really, there will be some pushback against the idea that you can create a new language, but at the time in 1913, this was a pretty popular idea. Okay. I also do want to stress there were people at this conference who were like, Japan chose the language of Tokyo to be its national language. France chose the language of Paris to be its national language. Choosing the capital makes sense. Why are we arguing about this? They were just in the minority in 1913. They wouldn't be within a few years. In any case, right, what the consensus that this conference comes to is that a language that represents the nation's present while also embodying its shared ethnic past had to be something they created. And that's why Fangyan were so important, right? Because they were not branches, subsidiaries, they weren't less important, they were all important in one way or another because they constituted the Chinese national body. So in 1913, we have our first Chinese national language, a new invention for a new nation. However, as I said, while the just choose a language to serve as the national standard, people were in the minority in 1913. Pretty quickly, they start to become not the minority, right? And that's because once the actual work came to getting people to speak this language, its challenges became significantly more obvious. Right? Those who have been tasked with the practical work of promulgating it quickly saw its shortcomings, casting doubt on the feasibility of enforcing a language that had few to any native speakers. Articles mocked it as like Qinglang Guoyu, so like blue-green Mandarin, neither donkey nor horse. And even those who were on board with this bold experiment began to sort of quietly doubt the practicality of it. Take for this instance, this man, Zhao Yuanren, his English name is up here, but his Chinese name is Zhao Yuanren. He was a graduate of Cornell and Harvard, and he was very committed to this idea of creating a language that represented China. And in particular, from his perspective, he thought he could scientifically engineer a language that was easiest for everyone to learn because it included elements from everyone's different Fangyan. He was very committed to this. I love people in their 20s. They're so idealistic. And actually he was so committed to this in 1921 that he actually made a recording of it. This is him making a recording of it. This is at Columbia University. He was making this recording. But by 1924, if you read his letters to his friends and family, he's starting to tell them that he doesn't think this is going to work, and that really they should start to presume that Beijing's Fangyan is going to be the national language, right? And so that leads him in 1925 to join, once he returns to China, he's in the United States, he returns to China in 1925, and that's when he starts to work with other reformers to actually make that policy. Right? Later in life, to me, I love reading his reflections on his later in life because it's so clear that he feels really, really mixed about it, right? On the one hand, one of his most famous quote, which I'll say here, is he said, "For 13 years, I was the sole speaker of this dialect meant to be the national language for 600 million speakers," which to me represents that he understood this was not going to work, right? But then in his oral history, he sort of pushed on this. He did his oral history in Berkeley, where he taught until he passed away, and lived until he passed away. He retired, then he passed away. But anyway, at Berkeley, he says to his oral history interviewers, right, they push him on this. They're like, "How did you ever think this is going to work?" And he got kind of defensive about it, right? He's like, "Well, in China, we invent new languages all the time, and we learn new Fangyan all the time, and like this is totally possible." And so I feel like he really feels mixed about it, right? That at least that's my interpretation from the way he talks about this later in life. Nonetheless, in 1925, he gives in, right? And he and a bunch of other people who were all on board with this early experiment were like, "Now we got to make it," right? And so in 1925, the language of Beijing was made the national language, and this dream of a hybrid national language faded away. Nonetheless, the story shows that at least for a little bit of time, right, for 12 years, one of the most prominent visions of the Chinese national language was an invented one that encapsulated China's shared cultural core based on the belief that no singular Fangyan was a natural national representative. And perhaps because of these earlier visions of China's language, perhaps because this earlier vision of China's language was so powerful, even after it failed, it still influenced how people thought about what language in China should be. State actors and their collaborators could not simply take for granted that saying, "Hey, we have a new Goyu, a new national language," that would simply make everyone accept it, right? They had to do the actual work to convince the public that one Fangyan could represent the nation in its entirety. Inversely, they had to make clear the connotations inherent in the word dialect, its presumption of hierarchy and dependency. They had to make clear that that was integral to what Fangyan were. Okay. Now, this transformation of Beijing's Fangyan into the national language in the eyes of public was partly done through policy. Okay. First, it was government decreed. Once we have start the Nanjing Decade in 1927, the government decrees that the national language should be taught in schools. They also encouraged national language use in radio and cinema, and supported magazines like National Language Weekly. Oh, no, sorry, I don't have a picture of that. That defended government policy and offered short, accessible language lessons. By the 1930s, these encouragements to speak the national language became threats. One example of this is cinema. In the 1930s, Chiang Kai-shek's government attempted to censor cinema in other Chinese Fangyan besides the national language, targeting in particular the thriving Cantonese movie industry in Guangzhou. On the one hand, these policies were not terribly effective at getting people to speak the national language. Most children did not attend schools in 1930s China, and among those that did, the central government did not have the reach to regulate what language teachers used in the classroom. Now, some people did. I interviewed a man in Xiamen who grew up in the 1930s, and his school taught Pudonghua, or I guess it was called Goyu at the time, right? Where he learned Goyu. He was very, very proud of it. And the reason he was so proud was because he knew that was not common, right? He was aware that most people his age did not learn Goyu in schools in the 1930s, right? And so again, you will meet people who learned this in the 1930s, but it was not common. And even then, the number of children who were actually in schools at the time was very low. Also, if they were in rural areas, in particular with schools that were associated either with left-wing groups or communist groups, often, almost always, they privileged literacy over oral language teaching, right? Like they cared much more about teaching people to read. And while the Cantonese movie ban sparked fierce debates among filmmakers and cultural critics, it was incredibly difficult to enforce. Keep in mind, this is in the midst of the Japanese invasion, right? The KMT government had other priorities, understandably. And so filmmakers, they either moved their production to Hong Kong, or they just didn't send them in for government approval because, again, during the war, there were other priorities, right? Now, but despite the fact that the government couldn't really enforce their policies, the existence of these policies still reinforced a hierarchy. Whether anybody spoke it or anybody cared, Beijing's Fangyan had a new name, Boyu, literally language of the nation. And this becomes a household term. It's used in newspapers, it's discussed on radio, and repeated in children's textbooks. In other words, regardless of who spoke it, national language policies normalized a hierarchy by claiming that one language is the language of the nation and implying everything else as non-standard subsidiaries. And sometimes this hierarchy was reinforced in ways that weren't explicit, done in ways where the act of doing, the act of creating the hierarchy was hidden behind claims of objectivity or science. The clearest examples of this was the discipline of linguistics. Linguistics in China underwent a huge transformation in the early 20th century. It was galvanized in particular by the May 4th movement, a series of protests against Japan's acquisitions of Germany's colonies in China that dovetailed with ongoing calls by educated elites for a complete upheaval of China's core cultural institutions. In the midst of this movement, many academics, inspired by May 4th praise for scientific inquiry, many of them were also educated abroad, right, began to eagerly develop new university programs meant to create modern empirical knowledge. Beginning in the early 1920s, a group of Chinese scholars began to advocate for the scientific study of languages at Chinese universities around the country. These men, most of whom, again, were trained abroad and therefore learned the science of comparative linguistics in the early 20th century. And they claimed that traditional ways of studying Chinese languages that had been done for centuries within China were outdated and unscientific, and that the only proper way to study Chinese languages was to use these methodologies from the West. Drawing upon decades of European and American presumptions about the way languages relate to one another, these men simply felt it was objective truth that languages existed like hierarchically, right? That languages evolved and stemmed from one another, and there were some that were more important than others. Actually, I'm just going to go ahead and let Professor of English Lin Yutang explain, which he did very, very clearly. Before I show this quote, because it's very blunt, and I love that. This is, especially since I just kind of like spicy academics, I find it funny. And this is like a commentary on a article about the wisdom of sort of earlier ways of studying Chinese languages from the Qing dynasty, and that there's a lot to be learned from that. And Lin Yutang has a very, very blunt retort to that, and it is this: there should be no confusion as to the definition of Fangyan. The world's languages are connected in one system called a yuanxi, or a family of languages. Language families are then divided into yuan, or languages, and within each language there are divisions of Fangyan, or dialects. We ought to declare that when we speak of Fangyan today, we are using it with the meaning from modern linguistics. And then he goes on to say, which is why this other guy arguing for like the wisdom of earlier times is wrong, right? And so what he's saying here is that he thinks that essentially it is merely objective truth that languages exist on a tree like this. I know this is impossible to read, but the point here is that I want the structure to be clear, right? So this is called the Shamba model of languages. It's from Germany. It's from the 18th century, 19th century. And essentially what's sort of important here is that the bigger branches are languages and the itty bitty little branches are dialects, right? There's a clear hierarchy here. And this is when Lin Yutang is talking about this is what he means, right? That this isn't a model, this isn't an argument, this is just objective truth to him, okay? So what's the takeaway here? First, the expectation in the early 20th century that in order for China to be a nation, it needed to have a national representative language created the broad presumption that there could be only one Chinese language. Second, the creation of a national language that took only one Fangyan as its standard allowed one Fangyan to gain cultural and political significance that other Chinese languages across the country did not have. And third, that cultural and political significance was emphasized through a number of venues, from education to media to academia. Nonetheless, I really do want to stress some caveats here. In the Republican period, the ability to reinforce this hierarchy was extremely uneven. Not everyone was exposed to this media, and while there were a lot of articles that emphasized the importance of the national language, there was also a lot of rhetoric that emphasized the national language was not inherently superior. Moreover, while speaking the national language was often tied to patriotism, generally speaking, popular rhetoric did not tie it directly to political loyalty, except for in a few instances like Cantonese movies, and there was pretty heavy pushback against that, right? So you would sometimes hear people say, speak Woyu because like that's the way to be patriotic. That didn't seem to have a lot of purchase in the Republican period. I think there's good evidence to show that didn't have a lot of purchase. There's also a competing political party here that actively pushed against that, the Communist Party, right? That argued pretty strongly that that was not the case, right? They argued pretty strongly for anti-hierarchies on this. In the 1930s, it's going to change, right? And finally, I do want to stress here that we can talk all day about rhetoric and why that matters, but most people are just like living their lives. It's like China's an overwhelmingly rural country. I promise you, foreigners or like farmers do not care about this at all, and so most people are just sort of living their lives and speaking their languages and making do the way that they always have. Right? Okay. But yet, as I introduced, the notion that Mandarin is the Chinese language is very pervasive and normative and political today. So I think it's worth talking about what happens then after 1949, after the creation of the People's Republic of China, so we can sort of see how this shift happens, where today speaking Putonghua is quite politicized. So in 1949, the Chinese, before we sort of mentioned 1949, before 1949, the Communist Party, they were pretty split on this. Most of them saw the need for a national language, but were quite deeply opposed to the idea of making it hierarchical. And on a lot of their linguistic experiments really tried to be quite inclusive in their languages. That inclusivity had limits. I don't have good evidence that they cared much about languages spoken by non-Han peoples, right? And they talked about sort of ethnic ethnic self-governance and these kinds of things. But when it came to sort of they're talking about the national language, they were really just focused on Hanyu Fangyan. But they tried to create, say, romanization systems that were flexible and could include lots of different Fangyan. And they were very cautious of how script reform impacted the other kinds of languages that people spoke. Right? So there was a real cognizance of this, at least among some in the Communist Party, not all. Many others were very, very sort of tied to the idea of nationalism and patriotism and believed that one standard language was really important. Okay, now once they became a ruling party in 1949, right, they renamed Woyu as Putonghua, or the common speech, although they, like, linguistically, there's very little difference here. They're kind of using the same national language. Increasingly, once they start governing, they also began to emphasize that while they do not want to eradicate Fangyan, there really is just one national representative, and it is Putonghua. And that is something that becomes very, very clear once we get into the early 1950s, right? I sort of want to give some examples here, right? For instance, in the 1950s, they hold a big nationwide Fangyan survey. I interviewed some people who were participating in this, so we could talk more about this in Q&A if you would like. But the idea behind this huge collection of data, which was really, really impressive, was solely sort of to create handbooks so that teachers can teach people in different areas of China Putonghua, right? They're very, very, very clear about this, okay? These languages are like how to Guangdong ren 怎么学普通话 is usually like Henan ren 怎么学普通话. Those are usually the names of these handbooks, right? And the idea here is to sort of, they very often talk about Fangyan as obstacles or problems, like Fangyan Wenti, or and that need to be overcome so that everyone speaks the same language. Right, that's a very clear hierarchy that becomes part of both academia and public policy, right? So this is their methodology, right? What I think is really interesting about this methodology is they use these little cards and have people pronounce how they say things so that they can create models that highlight the phonetic differences between, say, like Sichuanhua, right, and Putonghua. So the idea here really is to collect data so as to more effectively teach Putonghua, right? Not only are we creating a hierarchy through education, right, and academia, but we're also so here's an example of the handbook, okay? We're also creating them by politicizing the languages that people speak. And this becomes very clear after 1958. That year was the rollout of the Great Leap Forward, a sweeping economic policy meant to demonstrate the people's superhuman endeavors in economic production and cultural rejuvenation. The Great Leap Forward spirit was first and foremost applied to grain and steel production, but the movement's rhetoric imbued all areas of life, including the national language promulgation project. So we have like 推广普通话的大跃进, right? Like that's a very common phrase that we get in documents there. And they have a lot of these teaching exhibitions that are meant to show how to best teach 普通话 to sort of create the spirit of the 大跃进. And they will say things like, so here's an example of these teaching exhibitions, right? And they would say things like this. There are those who believe when the Liberation Army is at our defense, can it be considered doing revolution, or to participate in the socialist education movement is to do revolution. But as for promulgating 普通话 for the revolution, is that placing its value too high? Actually, in the age of our great revolution, whether it is a large-scale movement or everyday activities, it is all part of revolutionary work. To do educational work is to do revolution. To do cultural or cinematic work is to do revolution. To be a clerk, a service person, a ticket seller, a train attendant, or radio broadcaster is to all do revolution. The Great Leap Forward rhetoric, in other words, equated speaking 普通话 with other nation-building efforts, like developing oil fields or even winning wars. What goes unstated, however, is that if speaking 普通话 both represented and facilitated doing revolution, then not speaking the national language essentially amounted to not doing revolution, right? Which is incredibly political. Now, I want to stress once again, there is a huge gap between rhetoric and practice, right? Like in the Republican period, policy and propaganda only went so far, and people, of course, really just continued to speak their own languages. And you do see, for instance, at the local level, people saying, actually, you're supposed to be learning from the peasants, and we're supposed to be, right, sort of like seeing the peasants as the example, and they all do not speak 普通话, right? And so you do get lots of different kind of opinions on the ground. And again, most people just have other things to work with, right? This isn't their primary concern. But I do think that this politicization matters because it filters down, it imbues pedagogy, media, and even the very language we use to talk about these things. Okay, so at this point, you may be asking yourself, why does this matter? Calling something a language or a dialect doesn't seem like an earth-shattering event. But I'd argue this is about much more than what we call things. The words we use bound observable things to assumptions, ideas, and touchstones, and they frame our thinking and guide our actions, right? To presume that Fangyan has all the same connotations as dialects is to force China's linguistic landscape into a hierarchy in which all but one are subordinate. It also shows that this assumption of Fangyan subordination is not limited to linguistic structure alone. Calling one language a national standard and everything else variants really sort of like shapes what citizenship and national identity can mean. It also very much implicates power. When I say I speak a language, I own a particular kind of power. It is recognized globally as something that everyone can understand. To say I speak a dialect is to settle for an expression of identity that is limited in its scope and diminished in its significance, right? And I think that's what's really important here, right? Is that I think we can have a really interesting discussion in Q&A about why there are sort of limitations of the English menu of terms here of language and dialect. I think that's a really interesting and important discussion to have. But today, language and dialect have very clear power implications, right? And these have very material implications. And so that's why I think this matters, right? We invest in language education, right? We invest in structures to help people preserve their languages. We invest in media that allows us to continue to use and speak our languages. We don't do that, generally speaking, for something we call a dialect, right? We really have to fight for that. So that is why I think this really matters. And perhaps because of that, right, the framing of Fangyan as dialects has always had critics. So I just want to sort of end this talk with a very quick glance at one example of these kinds of pushbacks. Again, when I wrote this book, this didn't seem like that long ago, but now we're talking about like 13 years ago this happened. And this is from the city of Guangzhou in 2010, where a protest gathered in response to a decision by the municipal government to increase television offerings in Putonghua and thereby reduce its programming in Cantonese. In July of that year, protesters gathered in Guangzhou's People's Park with T-shirts and posters. They sang C-pop songs. It was great. Supposedly, I mean, I wasn't there, but it sounds like it was fun. Pictures look great. And this picture here, I think, is really, really interesting. So it says here, I love Cantonese. I don't speak, we would see this as Putonghua, right? Literally like stewed winter melon. And then I want to draw attention to several elements of the sign. First is instead of saying Putonghua here, we use Bodonghua, right? Like I think that's or Baodonghua. I think that's really interesting, right? It's a fun pun. I think it shows his discomfort with Putonghua as a language, right? That he does not have a similar pun for Guangdonghua here. I also think it's interesting, however, that the love here of his I love Cantonese is the flag of the People's Republic of China. This is a patriotic protest, right? This is not saying that we think Cantonese is a separate identity, or it's not saying that Cantonese or like the Cantonese separatist movement is none of those kinds of things, right? It is trying to reclaim a patriotic Chinese identity for Cantonese. And it reminds us, to me, of how in the early 20th century, you could say that any particular Fangyan was representative of the Chinese national identity, that it was part of that national identity. So I think that the legacies of that are very clear here. In this way, what counts as a language and what is merely a dialect is a battle over a place in a cultural hierarchy. It is a battle over whose language is more important to the nation and who has the power to define that. Right? Our language is the very lens through which we see the world, and it carries an enormous significance to how we see ourselves as people. I think very often about a Chicana feminist scholar named Gloria Anzaldúa. One of the things she says is, my language is my skin. It's very, very close to how we see ourselves as people. And therefore, this really does matter when we think about it in terms of broader cultural and material power. I'm going to stop there. I talked a little longer than I expected to, but I am very, very eager to hear your questions.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much, Gina, for that wonderful, wonderful talk. As I said at the beginning, we now have some time for questions and answers. If you're here in the audience, just raise your hand and make yourself known if you want to ask a question. If you're on Zoom, then please, as I explained, use the Q&A button in Zoom. And type your questions in there, and then I can read them out. Okay. All right. I think now you can really submit questions. But do we have any questions or comments?
Yeah.
Billy, please go first.
Yeah, it's very fascinating, and I'm a Cantonese speaker until 20 years old, until I was 20 years old. I couldn't understand a word of Putonghua. It was just like a Russian to me.
Yeah.
So I'm very fascinating. Fascinating talk. Okay, so make it very simple. I have 4 questions actually. So
4 questions. Okay.
I just make it very simple. Number 1 is before the 20th century, so 19th century. That's the early description of your presentation.
Yeah.
There's one thing that I just wonder whether you have considered that is the term of Mandarin, because I remember, I used to ask, people ask me English or other language.
Yeah.
They ask me, do you speak not Putonghua, but do you speak Mandarin?
Yeah.
So in other words, for some people, what we understood as Putonghua, to them is Mandarin in English.
Yes.
Right? But in Chinese, I would imagine that's Guanghua.
Yes, it is.
Guanghua.
Yes.
And Guanghua means if you want to be a Guan, you want to be a Mandarin, then you speak the Mandarin.
Yes.
Right? If you don't want to be a Mandarin or no longer Mandarin, you forget about it.
Yes.
So I just wonder whether you have sort of considered that. So that's the first question.
Yes.
Second question is about the sort of a little bit, almost like 10 years about the turn of the 20th century or a little bit earlier in Japan, British Japan. You know what I'm asking. Right? They went through the same thing.
Yes, they did.
They didn't have a language, a national language, even written system.
Yeah.
5 to 6
Yes.
different kind of written system, different scripts, different pronunciation, and everything is different. Within about 10 years or so, they somehow make the national language.
Yes.
But it's largely through, my understanding is largely through education system, but also the textbooks, the centralization of the textbook to the government, instead of letting the market decide who use the textbook.
Yes.
When you let the market decide, then actually they'll never make it.
Yeah.
Right? So I think the centralization of the choice of textbook into the Munbusho, that is the reason why they made it.
Yeah.
Now, but in order to do that, actually they went through a really painful process. And beyond that, actually they also have a lot of a whole pool of top-rate linguists, as you just mentioned, linguists involving in the building up. So it's not only government authority that's necessary, a Munbusho sort of implementation through the school system necessary, but also the academic linguistic Western style. That's what you said. That was important. And the main team of people in this group was all from Toda. But actually, they were opposed. They were minority, actually. All along, they were minority, but they have their power. Right? So they make it at the end. So I just wonder if you have some kind of relation, sort of a reference to that. But also, I know very little about India, but I know your institute is also very interested in India as well.
Yeah.
India is very famous for dialect.
Yes.
Right, so easily you go to Calcutta, 200 dialects, even today. So I just wonder what you might, I mean, it's not a part of the study, I know, but it would be very interesting if you brought in your question to compare with India, also former colony, and then Japan, how they deal with all these things. So there's
and Turkish is another interesting one.
Turkish is another one.
Yeah.
The last one actually is more contemporary thing, but I had some experience in working in National University of Singapore. In the time when Lee Kuan Yew was still the prime minister, not the senior minister, prime minister. Now, what I just make it very simple is in Singapore, as you know, Chinese is English is first language. Malay is the national language. Although not everyone can speak. But second language, Chinese, and then Tamil and Malay, and so forth. Now, my question here is that when they say Chinese, they really mean Chinese Putonghua.
Yes, they do.
But not dialect.
Yes.
Now, when I was there in the late 1980s, the interesting thing is, at first, Chinese as a language, not the national language, is a majority of Chinese, right? So that most people speak Putonghua, learn to speak Putonghua. Chinese was very, in a sense, it's hierarchically, it is higher than the dialect. But I witnessed myself in the election, they lost to people, I mean, campaigning in dialect.
Interesting.
I could see very soon they changed. Lee Kuan Yew also started to learn dialect. He didn't speak dialect. He didn't speak Putonghua. He speaks some dialect. But then he started to say, okay, I have to speak not only English, but also Chinese, Putonghua, but also some dialect. Otherwise, you cannot communicate with the community. You can't get the voters. So that's very interesting. Well, I just wonder whether you have some kind of comparison when you think about national language, Chinese dialect or Chinese dialect. Singapore seems to provide you a very good.
It's a fascinating example. There's lots of really good examples in Southeast Asia. Since I'm there, I'll go ahead and start with Singapore. I actually, the first thing I thought of when you said that about about the fact that they had to back away from that campaign was actually Taiwan, because in Taiwan, yeah, right, they tried very hard to push very strongly for everybody speak Putonghua and to sort of to get to the point where speaking anything besides Putonghua in Taiwan was very, very, very difficult, right? Like those structures were basically gone and those incentives were basically gone until you start to get more and more sort of like businesses who are like, we want to advertise to people and we can't advertise to people because they don't understand us, right? And they're the ones who end up putting a fair amount of pressure on the government there, because ultimately we want to be able to talk to people, right? So that's a really fascinating example. And Southeast Asia as well. So you have the example of Singapore, where Lee Kuan Yew is very, very blunt that Chinese equals Mandarin. And while I think you're right, they do back away from this, I think people I've talked to in Singapore, that had a really big effect, because you destroy structures when you do things like that, right? And another interesting example is Indonesia, right, where it's not even there that Chinese equals Putonghua, it's that Chinese languages were just outlawed altogether, and that doesn't stop people from speaking them. It destroys the structures that make it easier for people to preserve and be proud of their identities. And so I think that is sort of the commonality here. I mean, I very clearly have sort of strong, not strong, no strong. I very clearly have opinions about people should be able to speak what they want to speak, right? And should have the structures to do so, right? But there are places that are significantly harsher than the People's Republic of China, and Taiwan, Singapore, and Indonesia are good examples of that. Yeah. As far as Japan goes, I know less about Japan and India and Turkish, and I know more about what people in China are saying about these places. And you're absolutely right, Japan goes through a similar example. And in fact, in that 1913 conference, that's an example that gets brought up a lot, because they're like, this is what Japan did, right? They had a conference, they determined a pronunciation, they based it on the language of the capital. We need to follow Japan's example. So there's a lot of looking at Japan in that particular way. They look less at India. So I don't really know why they choose the examples that they do. My guess is that there are very strong ideas about what constitutes a modern nation, and they like to talk about France and Japan. Those are the ones that they talk about the most. Turkish is interesting. This is not my area of expertise, but there's a professor at the Washington University in St. Louis, who is writing a book about script reform, and he looks at sort of the Romanization movement and the phoneticization movement among Turkish speakers and Arabic, and looks at that influence on China. That's really, really interesting. But I think you're absolutely right, right? Like the people who are sort of pro-Beijing language are often seeing Japan as a very clear model there. And as far as the textbook marketing, that's also really fascinating, right? That the people who have an enormous amount of power in making language policy in China are textbook producers, and they are working within a capitalist market, right? So there is incentive for them to create textbooks that will be widely used, but you get a lot of different approaches and a lot of people doing different things. And also in Romanization systems, you have Mofo, you have like Wei Giles, you have all of these different things, because you kind of have a free-for-all for the textbook market. That's really fascinating. So Guanhua, yes, one of the hardest things about writing this book is that terms have different meanings and they don't translate well and they evolve, and that's very difficult. So yes, today, like Putonghua in English is either called Mandarin or called Chinese, and I don't like either of those terms. I tend to say Mandarin over Chinese, because I think that there are multiple Chinese languages. I mean, I really do, right? And I think that calling Putonghua Chinese just gives the game away, right? Mandarin, the reason we call it Mandarin is because a long time ago in the 19th century, right, it was a translation of Guanhua, right? But then that sort of stuck among English speakers as the language of the officials becomes official language, if that makes sense. Also, there's a shift in the 19th century of thinking of Guanhua or Mandarin, or they'll call it the language of the Mandarins, right? From being Nanjing based to Beijing based. And that happens in the late 19th century. Thomas Wade and Herbert Giles are really instrumental in making that shift. Right. But that is a leftover translation. What makes this even more complicated, right, is that Guanhua can actually refers to a Fangyan region. We will usually call that the northern Fangyan region. If I go way back to my little map. 1 second, where's my map? Nope, where'd it go? There. That green region is usually called the Guanhua region, and actually it's really tiny, but that's called the Guanhua Fangyan region, right? So that makes it even more complicated. I have no idea what we would I guess we would translate that into English as the Mandarin Fangyan region, which doesn't make sense because we usually think of Mandarin as a language, not a Fangyan region. So these terms are really messy. In my book, what I try to do is I try to use the language that my historical actors use, which often means that I'm using terms in their historical context and not necessarily how they're used today. And that was a choice I grappled with for a very long time. Also, it was a really, it felt like a compromise that I had to make to call my book Dialect and Nationalism in China. I didn't like that. But as my publisher correctly pointed out, if I called it Fangyan and Nationalism in China, no one would know what I was talking about. And if I call it Language and Nationalism in China, that has a different meaning, and also that's very close to John DeFrancis's book's name. So that's what ended up happening. Yeah, these terms get really messy. There's a scholar of there's a scholar at, I think she's at Columbia, who writes about what she calls super signs, and I find that incredibly useful. But essentially, it's this idea that a translation is not a transparent pairing of two words, that there is a cultural, there's a creative process that goes into that. And so she calls these sort of pairing of two words, if I would put computer and dianao, she calls that the computer dianao super sign, right? To highlight the creative process that goes into deciding that one thing fits with another. And I think thinking of Fangyan and dialect as a super sign requires us to look at the history as to why we translate it that way. Why, or the Guanhua Mandarin super sign, right? Why do we translate it that way? And what do we gain and lose by doing that, right? Is really, really fascinating. So I don't know if that answers your question. I hope it does.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for your great questions.
Yeah, thank you. We've got quite a lot of questions online, so I'll at least try to get started with that. So one question comes from Richard van Ness Simmons. He says, thank you for your delightful and thought-provoking talk. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about the choice of Beijing in the 1920s. At that time, the capital was in Nanjing. Why was the language of Nanjing not chosen?
Oh, great question. This is in the early 1920s. My guess is, in the way that they're talking about it, right, is that these sort of so there's two reasons. One is that these conversations had been ongoing throughout the 1910s and early 1920s, and sort of the Beijing Fangyan camp had been sort of pushing for this for a really long time. So I don't think there was as far as I know, I always want to say as far as I know, there was not a huge push to say hey, the capital moved to Nanjing, we should consider Nanjing, because those conversations about Beijing had been happening for a long time, and they've been happening before the capital moved to Nanjing, right? And so that's one of the other reasons. The other is that a big part of when they start to really take this seriously is in the wake of the May 4th movement. And I think the May 4th movement really shifted the connotation of Beijing, right? So Beijing had been seen as sort of this as an association with the Manchus and the association with the Qing dynasty, suddenly shifted to sort of the association with China's educated cultural elite, right? This is where these this is where these conversations are happening. They're happening at Beijing University. And so I think that new generation of people are looking at Beijing in different ways. So I think that is sort of, that's sort of the short answer I have for that. I once got asked a version of this question that I also think helps to reveal a little bit of why I think this happened is, was anybody really convinced it was ever going to be anything but Beijing? And the answer to that is yes, right? But I think that question shows that for a very long time, this was kind of seen by a lot of people as a foregone conclusion. And certainly the study of history tells us that foregone conclusions are never foregone. We never know what's going to happen. And I think it's really fascinating to look at histories that could have been and weren't, right? But it's also worth keeping in mind that for a long time, people presumed this was going to be the end of the story. And I think that helped to shape why, when this sort of experimental phase failed, that's what they fell back on.
Yeah, thanks.
And by the way, thank you for coming. Your work is really, really influential to me. So.
Do you have any questions here? Yes, at the very back, please.
Hi, thank you. So speaking of the May the 4th movement, I suppose like the modernization of the written Chinese also happens around the same time.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if the modernization in that and the Putonghua movement is kind of like synchronized, or something promotes something else.
Great question. What was your name? Danny, nice to meet you. This is a great question. So actually, there's sort of three prongs here, right? One is spoken language reform. One is script reform, right? What are we doing with Chinese characters? How do we feel? Do we want to keep them, simplify them, standardize them, get rid of them altogether, right? And then the third one is sort of like stylistic written language reform, right? Which is how what are sort of the grammar and syntax that we're using to write, right? Or what we would call sort of vernacular language movement, the vernac. So sometimes these are thought of as three different things, right? And interestingly, the question about spoken language was probably the least contentious. I mean, I like looking into this stuff, so I think people are really debating these things in a really interesting way. But as far as the things that like really get people angry, even Zhang Bingling, right? He was pretty mad at the thought of Beijing being the standard for the national language, but he was so mad at the thought of getting rid of Chinese characters. Like he cared way more about that. Right? So that was much more contentious. So there's lots of ways these intersect, even if there are people working them in separate ways. But I think it's worth keeping in mind how a couple of them intersect, right? So in terms of script reform, there is a pretty strong movement to get rid of characters altogether and move to a phonetic system, many of which, so either a phonetic system, something like what Japan does with its phonetic script, or a romanization movement, right? To use Roman letters to write out Chinese language. Actually, Zhao Yunren, not only is he involved in trying to promulgate this national language, he actually invents a new romanization system. I don't know if you've seen it. It's so fascinating. It is so clearly from the mind of a man who is very clearly a genius, but like doesn't know what it's like to be not very good at learning languages. He feels very strongly that there need to be visual clues to how like tones, right? That like if I just wrote out like Fangyan, like Fangyan versus Fangyan, right? Like that, like if I just write the English letters, the tones aren't obvious. So he inserts extra letters to denote tones, which means there's all these random Y's and Z's and H's in these letters that look really strange, right? But I don't want to say it's strange. One time in a talk, I said it was really strange, and someone in the audience got really mad at me because he had learned that system and he was convinced it was the best one. I'm getting distracted. In any case, right, one of the battles over the romanization system, right, is that if you have something incredibly detailed like Zhao Yuren's Guoyu Luomazi, you really cannot accommodate any language but one because it is meant to be incredibly specific, right? You have other attempts at creating romanization systems that are significantly more phonetically flexible and therefore can accommodate different kinds of Fangyan. But they were still under the recognition that if you start to Romanize things and you have a national language, you are eventually going to leave people out, whereas Chinese characters are very phonetically flexible. Right? So that's one of the ways they intersect, right? The other is what constitutes Baihua, right? What constitutes a vernacular language? There's a lot of debates about this as well. A lot of the people who are sort of at the vanguard of the Baihua movement studied abroad, right, or learned abroad, and we're trying to sort of fit vernacular Chinese into a Western model. So like a really interesting example of this is when we start to get the female pronoun, right? There's a lot of reasons we get the female pronoun, but one of them is to translate foreign language stuff that has female pronouns, right? But there's a sense in which the Baihua movement is incredibly Westernized and therefore very imperialistic. And therefore there are attempts to sort of shift towards a vernacular that is based on the way people speak in different Fangyan. So there's actually like a Cantonese literature movement in the 1940s, which is an attempt to basically transcribe Cantonese and use Cantonese grammar to write out literature, and that is a true Baihua that is indigenous and therefore anti-imperialist. So there's other examples, but I think those are two really clear ones where you have that intersection and where they're talking to each other. Great question.
I think there was another.
I just wanted to chime in on this question of Beijing, right? So we also know, right, that, you know, anyone who tries it, right, standard Putonghua and Beijinghua are also very different, right? So I'm just curious, when they decide, once they decide, okay, Putonghua is going to be Beijinghua, but not quite.
Yeah.
How do they decide what doesn't make the cut into Putonghua?
That's a great question. So with the Republican period, I know of less official conversation of this, and I don't know how much of this is just I didn't have access to the documents, and how much of it is that they're just having less conversation about this. But the CCP, they're pretty deliberate about this, and their definition of Putonghua actually is, what is it? It's like Beijing Fangyan Wei Kouyin. I'm gonna use English here because I'm gonna get the Chinese wrong on this, but I'm gonna get the Mandarin wrong. It's using Beijing's pronunciation as standard pronunciation, using Northern Fangyan or Beifang Fangyan as the base Fangyan, and then using modern vernacular literature for the standard vocabulary and grammar. So that's part of it. And when they try to convince people, like, we're not trying to take away your Fangyan, because they're very worried about a revolt on that. And so they're like, we're not trying to take away your Fangyan. And in fact, what makes Putonghua beautiful and amazing is that we actually include the best of all the Fangyan and leave away the bad of all the Fangyan, right? And so this is a very sort of standard narrative there. As far as sort of what counts, right? I mean, there is a government committee that talks about this, right? They standardize what pinyin is, but to some extent, right, this often comes less through people saying like, these are the only things that count, right? And less of like, depending on when and how to enforce it. And they don't really start to strongly enforce this, I think, until very recently. There's a language law in the early 2000s that starts to say sort of when you can use what and in what context, right? But like, if you look at like online discourse, no one's gonna be like, no one's gonna come and like take you away because you're using a Cantonese term here or there, right? If you write entirely in Cantonese online, or you speak entirely in Cantonese on like Douyin, sometimes you get messages to stop doing that, right? But like, as far as what vocabulary sort of makes it in, right? Languages are organic. That sort of generally tends to happen, right? And so there's only so much control that happens here, right? But generally speaking, that's how they define it, and that's how they differ from just Beijing Fangyan.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I probably should come back to some of the questions we have online. Sure. I think I'll take a few together because they're quite a lot. So we've got one question from Mariana Milling, and the question is the claim that a dialect cannot be a Muyu, or mother tongue, somehow an illusion that in Taiwan, they call Taiwanese the Muyu and have several endeavors to revitalize it. There was a short period in the late 40s to do that too. Another question comes from Jace Au, and the question is, may I ask what happened back at the conference in 1911 that made Cantonese lose out to Mandarin when they voted? It seems that many revolutionaries back then were from southern China, and many overseas Chinese influenced by more politically progressive ideas then were also from Guangdong, southern China. And maybe a third question that kind of fits in with that is from Jason Keane, and that is, in what ways, or if at all, the creation and spread of Mandarin or Donghua has influenced overseas Chinese?
Yeah, great. These are all great questions. So from what I understand from the first question is the idea that dialect does not equal Muyu implicated from Taiwan. I genuinely don't know. That I wish I did. I don't know if the people who are sort of arguing that are taking Taiwan as sort of a model here, like in particular in sort of like a few years ago when this conversation was happening. That consultant cited actually the United Nations Charter on what constituted a Muyu or a mother tongue And there it says that mother tongues belong to ethnicities. And so that's what he sort of clung to on this, right? Which to me means the UN Charter probably needs to be rewritten to be a little bit more inclusive. But that is what he cited as far as being that. To me, that came from, my guess is that came from a sort of fear of Cantonese kind of taking a life of its own and being sort of implicated to a Chinese identity that is not necessarily tied to the Chinese state. That's my guess. But as far as what happens in Taiwan in terms of making Taiwan a muyu, that's a really fascinating topic that I wish I knew more about, and I cannot answer for you, but I wish I could. But thank you for asking it, because now I want to go look into it. So let's see, what made Cantonese lose out in the conference in 1913? So what actually happens in this conference, to the best of my knowledge, right, because there's like a little, there's some documentation of it, is essentially a bunch of people get together, and you do have like southern camps and northern camps, and they fill out this list of characters and saying this is how we think it should be pronounced, and then they try to come to a compromise. As far as I know, there is not a vote to make Cantonese like writ large the national language, right? If that happened, I had a hard time finding like proof from that time period that happened. Rather, it was sort of a like North versus South kind of thing, because Southern Fangyan do have some sort of linguistic characteristics in common, largely with sort of like how they split, right? Like if we have like a group of characters that are all pronounced like Guang or something like that, it's like how we split them, right? And so that is more the conversation that's happening. And you are absolutely right, that an enormous number of revolutionaries are coming from the South, right? And that they are thinking of ethnicity and nation in ways that is quite anti-Northern, right? In part, again, because I think they're associating the North with the Manchus, right? And other non-Han people. So there is kind of a sort of Han ethnic tint to this, right? A Han ethno-racial tint to this that is associated with this new Chinese nation. And so what you find among them is that they are less, I mean, there are certainly people who are like, Cantonese is a great language, right? But usually that's not the argument they're making. Usually the argument they're making is Beijing is not it, right? Usually the argument they're making is that like our Southern Fangyan have a really long history. Our Southern Fangyan are very tied to ancient Chinese. And this is not being just made by Cantonese speakers. This is made by speakers of like Hokkien, of Hakka. Hakka really, they make this argument pretty strongly too, right? And so the argument is that those languages are in fact closer to ancient Chinese because of history and because of the lack of contact with people in the North, and therefore better represent China. And so that is why they're pushing in this conference to create sort of a new language, not even a new language, but just like an amalgam language that brings together these Southern Fangyan. And that tends to be the argument you hear from revolutionaries from the South. Oh, sorry, last one. Shoot, I just wrote down creation and I don't remember what the question was. I'm sorry.
The question was basically whether like Putonghua and Mandarin and standardization, what impact that has had on overseas Chinese.
Overseas Chinese, thank you. I don't know why I didn't write that down. That is a great question. And I think it depends on where overseas, right? So on the one hand, right, I think we've talked a little bit already about Southeast Asia, where I think the sort of like Putonghua equals national language really impacted Chinese in Singapore. In places like Indonesia, right, all Chinese languages were more or less stripped of their sort of linguistic rights in Indonesia. And so that didn't matter quite as much. To me, what matters, if I look at places like the United States, right, I spend a lot of time talking to Cantonese speakers overseas. And the way it impacts them is because China is a powerful country that people understandably want to get to know better, right? Human-to-human contact between people in China and people in the United States is a good and important thing, right? Also, people in the United States genuinely want to be closer to their, or overseas Chinese in the United States and Canada and Europe, they want to have that connection, and they want to have the structures to have a connection to their ethnic heritage, right? And the way that this often impacts them is that it is harder and harder for them to be able to preserve their local languages because the structures just aren't there, right? And so I was involved with a group that tried to ensure that Cantonese teaching at Stanford continued, right? A lot of Bay Area universities are taking this very seriously because Cantonese is the most commonly spoken Chinese language in the Bay Area, right? More so than Mandarin. And so this is really personal. This is really important to them. Another example, for instance, is that like Chinese assessment exams, I think it was in Ireland, weren't allowing people to use fantizi, were allowing them to use traditional characters. It's like a lot of people grew up using that, right? That you are creating that hierarchy among them, not by being like political and saying you can't learn these languages. It's by taking away those structures. And so I think that the way that it impacts us, right, is that when we in the United States, when we repeat, right, the verbiage that Cantonese is just a dialect, Hokkien is just a dialect, Taiwanese is just a dialect, and therefore, if we have Mandarin, we're covered. We don't need to do anything else, right? That we are actively contributing to that loss of structures. And so to me, that is the biggest impact, right? If we think about linguistic loss, right? I think we often think of it as being passive, right? That languages die, dialects die, but truthfully, I think we have a lot more agency than we like to think that we do. And by we, I mean all of us, right? And some of us have significantly more agency than others. I don't have that much agency compared to, say, like the provost at Stanford who can decide what classes to teach, right? I don't have nearly as much agency as that person. But languages don't live or die on their own. We let them die by sucking away the structures that make their continuation possible. And so I think that the way this rhetoric has impacted things for overseas Chinese, I think that's a big thing that has happened. I'd like to hope that that's changing a little bit, but time will tell.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yeah. Then maybe I'll because I'm cognizant of time, but maybe two final questions from Zoom that that we can have sort of as a last question. They're both from Dong Zhou-Xin, and I thought I should mention them. So first, the first question is about the Cultural Revolution and what happened to language policy then.
Yeah.
And the second one is where it says, I'd like to know about the bottom-up quote unquote factor in making Putonghua or other standard languages in other countries. As far as I understand, making a standard language has not always been top-down in China, as well as many other countries. Those who speak quote unquote dialects would force themselves or their children to speak the standard language. So I see that it's not just a one-way street to make a standard language. In other words, it is not just state power that pushes to make a standard language. I guess it's more of a comment, but if you have anything to say about that,
that comment is actually I do have. I'll respond to that as sort of my final comment here. The Cultural Revolution is really, really interesting. So I will say that my knowledge of the Cultural Revolution and thinking of source bases, that is the point at which my archival access sort of ended, right? I had a hard time getting a hold of archives and archival materials past the Great Leap Forward. But I did talk to people, and essentially what we see happening in the Cultural Revolution is, on the one hand, you still have the rhetoric, right, that speaking Putonghua is speaking the language of the revolution. That continues to happen. At the same time, however, a few things happen. So you have sent down youths, right, going from cities into the countryside, and oftentimes people I've talked to, some of them are told, like, continue to learn Putonghua, or they feel themselves tasked with teaching Putonghua in the countryside. But a lot more of them are like, no, you live here, you learn from us, you learn our language, right? So I think that was actually significantly more common. As far as policy goes, another sort of interesting anecdote from the Cultural Revolution was that local theater, generally speaking, was significantly winnowed down during the Cultural Revolution, but that was largely not because of. So I was talking to somebody who's in Cantonese theater, and it's like essentially we had to stop doing it during the Cultural Revolution, less because of language and more because there were like a very, very limited number of plays people were allowed to do during the Cultural Revolution. That said, there was some. I do know of an example, and this is in the North, but a person who wanted to be able to reach audiences and therefore asked to be able to do local theater in local languages so that they could reach audiences. So I think you see a lot of push and pull during the Cultural Revolution. And also at this point, however, like a lot of the structures that would be involved in promulgating a language are kind of gone during the Cultural Revolution. So that's another part of it as well, right? Bottom up in sort of promulgating Mandarin. Yes, I certainly do not want to sit here and say that it is only the state that is enforcing this, right? And that nobody else is sort of on board with a national language. It's quite common for people to tell me and for me to read in the past, right? Of course, everyone's got to speak the same language. How else are we going to talk to each other? I do think, however, that it is important to talk about the power differential here, right? And so people who are sort of bottom up pushing for the national language, right? And not just the national language, but also for the stripping away of structures that allow people to be multilingual or use their Fangyan in the way that they want to, right? That is something that you need to have a lot of power to have, or you need a lot of power to do. And that is why I think I focus on state rhetoric and state here, because they have significantly more power in this particular regard, whereas people who are sort of pushing against the state line here have less power. Right? And that is not to say that it is entirely grassroots people are all like, let's not focus on the national language and then that they're being sort of like forced from on top. That's obviously, there's much more complicated than that. I also do think, however, that when we think about sort of grassroots support for a national language policy, it's worth asking how and why that is, right? So one of the things I get told a lot of like, well, of course, people are teaching their kids Putonghua because that's where the like economic incentive is, right? I hear that a lot in Hong Kong, right? Like, let's all learn Mandarin because that's where the money is. That's how you get a good job. And my answer to that is, I have a lot of empathy for that, but why is that, right? What can we do as a society, or let's put it this way, do we want as a society for that to be normal and for that to be just the way things are? Or is that something we want to challenge, right? And this is what I mean when I say that like we have agency here, right? It's not like economics incentives just like emerge out of the blue. They happen because of decisions that we as society make, but also the policymakers make, right? And so I think in thinking about sort of bottom up and top down, power can be really, really complicated. And as such, I think that your point is incredibly well taken. But I also think that if we're not making power part of this conversation, that we're missing something. So that would be sort of my yes and response to that. I also think that's a good place to end. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much.
No, my pleasure. This was such a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you. I was just about to say, thank you again for taking the time to give us this wonderful talk and also very patiently answering all our many questions. So yeah, thank you very much.